What's good, everybody? Illumina Confirmed. GEN, Genetic Engineering and Biology News, Mary Ann Leinbert Inc. Publishers. Bill Gates advocates genomics-backed global health at Illumina Genomics Forum. The Microsoft co-founder and philanthropist call to action emphasizes humane infectome mapping, pathogen surveillance, and microbiome understanding by Jonathan D. Grinstein, PhD, October 4th, 2022. San Diego, California, a day after the billionaire philanthropist and the world's fifth richest person, divulged his hesitancy to donate his fortune to climate change. Bill Gates spoke at the Illumina Genomics Forum, IGF, as an exponent for biotechnological progress, notably in the arena of disease, both non-communicative or infectious. Gates is putting his money where his mouth is, having recently stated that he plans to give virtually all his wealth to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, kicking off the third day of the IGF Illumina Genomics Foundation. The Microsoft co-founder and philanthropist offered his take on the future of global health, focusing mainly on the pathway to end the cycle of panic and neglect the permanent infrastructure for pathogen preparedness. The field fielded a few questions from Candy Rogert, Vice President of Scientific Research at Illumina. Pathogen surveillance progress requires genomics. We don't want another pandemic, Gates said. It's 20 million lives, $20 trillion, huge deficits, learning loss, mental stress. We are going to be digging our way out of this for a long time. The only way we are going to get back on track is a combination of better tools, where genomics plays a big role, and better targeting, where surveillance enabled by genomics plays a big role. The pathogen surveillance capabilities, according to Gates, are still somewhat limited, advocating for sequencing regularly. He pointed to the value that sequencing sewage has had throughout the pandemic and even before. We've been using sewage sequencing for decades for polio, and it works for cholera, said Gates. Amazingly, you wouldn't think it would necessarily work for a respiratory virus, but in the case of COVID, it gives you the best, almost real-time signal, not just prevalence in your community, but also a sense of what the various variants are. For another example, Gates spoke about the Seattle flu study, which by using examples of respiratory systems is trying to characterize the populations of various respiratory viruses and discern how those are spread, which is important for quarantine techniques, But these studies can't just be a one-off, suggesting we need ongoing respiratory surveillance. At the heart of all this work on regular respiratory disease transmission and bioterrorism surveillance lies genomics. Having genomics data about respiratory disease transmission will help identify the initial outbreak and warn people, said Gates. The actions you take at the very beginning make a huge difference because otherwise you get exponential growth and geographic spread. These tools are getting to the point where it will eventually be common sense to come up with countermeasures. With so much open source information being put out, Gates thinks we will be able to have genetic libraries of pathogens that improve our ability to intervene, whether with antivirals or antibiotics. Genomics is how we get the information. Understand what these antibody populations, what does this breakthrough look like, and feeding that into these shape space tools that will only get better after the pandemic, said Gates. The gene sequencing is the basic starting point that we have to have both the non-pharmaceutical interventions but also the starting line of building the interventions. Genomics was critical for work that gave rise to the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine and ongoing pharmaceutical disease measures, such as developing proteins to block viral transmission. Although today's vaccines have saved countless lives, Gates thinks that we will have a long way to go to produce the ideal vaccine. They don't protect for decades or block infection, and they are not universal in the sense of taking the entire coronavirus family and creating antibodies that broadly protect, said Gates. To this point, he discussed the potential of mapping proteins and protein shapes with programs like Rose TTA Fold and Alpha Fold 2 for drug design, as well as project for the Institute for Protein Design at the University of Washington School of Medicine, working on the breadth of vaccine protection, nixing malnutrition with NGS. In addition to developing new tools and strategies to reduce the burden of infectious disease, Gates spoke about another leading cause of child mortality in developing countries, nutrition. To exemplify our lack of understanding of the topic, he noted that even if twins get the same diet, one of the twins will have stunting and never fully develop mentally and physically. This research can potentially have a tremendous impact, as over 30% of African children develop into adults with malnutrition. By looking at the microbiome of infants, we can sense what good gut health looks like. But Gates says we are gaining understanding by looking into the microbiome and understanding the complex interactions between the immune system and this microbiome. Understanding these bacteria is something we've been blind to, said Gates. There are trillions of microorganisms living inside of us, and we're just beginning to get a statistical sense of which ones are associated with good outcomes and which ones are associated with inflammation and bad outcomes. We couldn't do this without cheap sequencing. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing nutrition interventions to give kids food that encourage the good part of the microbiome and discourage the bad part. That is very promising, because in the case of nutrition, we're seeing that these interventions could be very cheap, said Gates. Equitable access to genomics. The conversation's final segment pertaining to the importance of equitable genomics. You do need to make sure that we're going about all this genomic work. We're doing it in an equitable way, said Gates. Well, Gates has advised his friends to get 950 Galleri test, a blood test that can detect 50 different types of cancer from the lab Grail, which is owned by Illumina. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does not prioritize developing novel therapeutics for cancer and genetic illnesses that can cost patients hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Instead, Gates is focused on making sequencing equitable across the globe. During the pandemic early on, most of the viral sequencing was done in rich countries, so there is a lack of understanding of exactly what was happening in Africa. Gates says that understanding the variants coming out of Africa has importance beyond the continent and helps the world know what's going on. This inequity is further affected by the limited existing genomics data on Africans. First, the African genetic background is more diverse than any other population, Gates said. In terms of understanding and dealing with their particular health challenges, we need to do better in getting that information into the databases, which today is only about 1% of the information, so equity's got to be the guide that we're doing here. That's where our foundation has a priority. Finding exactly where those gaps are and finding the right partners to solve those things. Gates closed his talk on the duality of many of these global health issues. Quote, "The current health circumstances post-pandemic are not what we want them to be, but on the other hand, we have this innovation, much of it underpinned by genomics. So I'm very excited about how we can take that capability and use it for dramatic improvements in human health all over the world." So I wanted to share that article with you guys. And show you guys some of this stuff as well. And this is a video I did about this article a few days ago. And this is a pretty big, giant thread of information. This is another part of this. Nobody's ever talked about this throughout the whole entire time of like the last few years. There's another one I could show you too that nobody's ever discussed. This one. And I'm just going to show this once again real quick and cut it off there. And nobody's ever talked about this, but yet there it is. The coronavirus research team at JCVI. And this guy is probably the most interesting one because he's like a top, some type of high, I'll read it. Richard Schuerman is leading a team of investigators at JCVI in response to the COVID-19 outbreak through his NIH-sponsored Bioinformatics Resource Center project. His team released a dedicated public web portal for the SARS-CoV-2 virus during the early stages of the outbreak to ensure data and tools are acceptable to frontline researchers worldwide. Additionally, in collaboration with investigators from La Jolla Institute for Immunology, Dr. Schuerman and his team provided machine learning methods to help complete the first analysis that identified potential targets for human immune responses to SARS-CoV-2 infection. This information is crucial to the design and evaluation of diagnostics and vaccine candidates funding National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases surveillance testing for SARS-CoV-2. To improve workplace safety, JCVI has instituted surveillance testing led by Richard Schuerman of pooled nasal swab samples with an in-house validated RT-qPCR assay using the primers probes developed by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, set up to combat a lack of fast, inexpensive, and reliable testing infrastructure. This weekly bi-coastal testing program was added as a layer of risk mitigation to our COVID-19 workplace policy that also includes masking, physical distancing, staying home when sick, daily temperature screening. JCVI employees can also opt in to research study to compare SARS-CoV-2 detection in paired self-collected nasal swabs, funding private donors in JCVI. And that guy is like from, oh no, this guy John Glass. This guy is creepy too. These two guys are like the top creepiest ones on here. Aside from Venter, whose website this is, this guy is SARS-CoV-2 defense mechanisms through an IARPA-funded collaboration with investigators at Harvard Weiss Institute, yada yada yada. But yeah, this is like the actual COVID-19 research team. Anyways, that's the thread about the Illumina aspect of all this. JCVI and Illumina are like right across the street from each other in San Diego, so yeah, this is all goes under my thread, Earth Biogenome Project. Peace and love.